Hi, I'm Holly. Welcome to 5-Minute Birth Classes. Today we are talking about bleeding in early pregnancy. So this is not just for the first trimester, although I know this is going up in the first trimester folder, as early pregnancy bleeding can actually affect you anywhere from the start of your pregnancy till about 16 weeks. It usually resolves by then. So these are all the causes for bleeding under 20 weeks. Now, disclaimer, I'm not covering miscarriage in detail in this one because that deserves a full session of its own. So there will be some notes in here that refer to miscarriage. So just be aware of that if that's going to be triggering for you. And there will be a full session on that if you want to know more. So one of the first types of bleeding that might happen is called an implantation bleed, and that happens when the little embryo of your baby implants into your uterus. It usually happens about 2 weeks after conception, and you can sometimes get it confused with a period, although it'll be a weird one. It'll be very light, it might not last more than 1 or 2 days, and that's just your baby implanting into the uterus lining. So the next one is a subchorionic hematoma, which is a really fancy way of saying there was a blood blister created when your baby implanted into the uterus. Now, this blood blister that forms at the point of implantation, it grows with your baby. So as your baby grows, it gets a little bit bigger, there's more blood that ends up in there. They're usually picked up on scans. They usually resolve by themselves anywhere between like 10 and sometimes as late as 14 or 16 weeks. They can resolve earlier. There's 2 ways that they resolve. They either pop and cause bleeding. With that, you get some cramping, and that's not actually from the hematoma, that's from your cervix opening up to let the blood out. But obviously, still cramping. And they can also sometimes just be reabsorbed by the body. Your body notices what's going on, goes, that's not cool, cuts off that little blood capillary vessel, whatever is supplying the blood blister, and then just reabsorbs the blood. So at some point on a scan, they'll say, oh, you don't have one of those anymore. There are a few different types of miscarriage. I will very quickly mention them just so you know that they will be covered in another episode. So just skip ahead like 30 seconds if you need to. So this includes chemical pregnancy, complete miscarriage, incomplete miscarriage, missed miscarriage, and molar pregnancy. And I'll be going into those in a different episode. There's also threatened miscarriage, which is where you stay pregnant, you have bleeding, but there's no reason for it. There's no obvious like, oh, this is why. And that's just the overall term that we use if we're like, oh yeah, you had bleeding, we don't know why. It's a threatened miscarriage, but you're still pregnant. That one can be quite stressful because it's a threat and it's a miscarriage, and they're both big, stressful words. But it just means that we don't know why it's happening. Now, there's also bleeding that can come from an ectopic pregnancy. So an ectopic pregnancy is an embryo that's implanted into the wrong place, which is causing pain and bleeding. Most commonly, this is in your fallopian tube, so the tube that connects your ovary down to the uterus. But it can also include pregnancies that have implanted somewhere else that they're not meant to, so in your cervix or in like a scar if you've had previous surgery or a cesarean section. So if it's a baby that's healthy and growing, which is why it's causing you pain and bleeding, but in a really bad spot for you, this is usually picked up quite quickly because you have a lot of pain and bleeding, and it requires emergency surgery to remove because it can actually cause some really like bad ongoing bleeding for you, and you are a very important person. There's also cervix irritation. So this is where if you've had a previous LETS procedure or any scars on your cervix, as everything grows and stretches, you can pop a couple of capillary vessels. There's a lot of blood supply to your cervix. Also sometimes sex or a pap smear in the first trimester can also pop a capillary, cause a bit of bleeding. Now, if you're a negative blood group, then there's something called anti-D, and that's a whole nother session that you will require if you have bleeding in the first trimester. And that's it for today. That's my 5 minutes. See ya.